on in the last 3 or 4 months is also a big topic in our culture today.
Right.
And the fact that it was a academic, scholarly pursuit in the 70s and 80s by Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and those folks, and stayed at that level. And this was at people of your ilk, right? They were discussing these big pieces and how systemic racism is actually woven into our culture, our institutions, our speech, our thinking, and that has somehow shared with the public at large, because we need to understand our history if we're not going to repeat it, and we need to understand our history so that we can be more kind to one another, that piece. So that's where I think the origin is beautiful and wonderful. When the ideology then becomes, oh, we're teaching CRT to children, the people that don't have time to watch or read about critical race theory think, oh my God, they're teaching my kids things that I don't want them to be taught, which again is not accurate, because CRT is a academic institution, or it has an academic origin. And so maybe pieces and parts of that are being shared. But that's where that ideology gets crazy, because then you're like, well, that doesn't even make any sense. But then what the left, in my opinion, is doing wrong is when you go in and teach pieces of that, like diversity, inclusion, and equity at the corporate level. And as you know, I do some corporate coaching with media executives, and they've all shared with me that when they have to teach some of the thinkings of critical race theory, which is what the right is saying is being taught, and it is now in institutions, educational institutions specifically, some of the largest Fortune 100 companies that you've actually spoken for in front of. 26 of the Fortune 100 companies, according to Christopher Rufo, who is a journalist and scholar on this subject, said that they're teaching this. And what they're teaching is where my approach, again, is more the ideology versus how we could actually get it done. If the collective goal is to teach history that it was painful to teach and painful to listen to, that's one thing. But if it's to come in and say to a group of executives that your thinking is based on white supremacy, and you guys are all racists inherently, and your implicit bias is causing destruction to our culture and to the team and to your company. And I'm not pulling punches. That's what they're saying. If you look at like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book, she talks about the fact that we're all racist. And I, for one, admitted this to my buddy who wrote a book, Letters to My White Male Friends. He's a black DEI consultant, lawyer, educator, author, super smart dude. And we had the same conversation. And I said to him, like, I know your practice, your actual consultancy doesn't do this because you know it doesn't work.
Right.
And he's like, you're right. The approach is really important. And that's where ideology, in this sense, goes too far, where we're not getting anything done as a culture. If we want to teach history to our kids, if we want to teach systemic racism and how we can actually buttress that through education, we can't start accusing people like you and me of being virulent racist, because that's a word that is as toxic as pedophile. Like, you can't call someone a racist.
When an educational approach starts off as accusatory rather than sort of explanatory,
right?
Problems always result. In fact, if the history of race in America is taught right, everybody goes away never having been accused of being a racist themselves, wondering though if they are. And that's the Socratic questioning. Boy, am I like that? Do I do that? That's if you present it. But there are too many white folks these days who have critical race theory has become what there's an ancient word that comes from Jewish history, a shibboleth. A shibboleth, you could tell a member of the enemy because they would pronounce a word a certain way. That was a shibboleth, a giveaway. So if critical race theory, it's almost like what you say about critical race theory is a shibboleth. You can tell whether they're in our camp, our tribe, or the other tribe. Right. And it's too bad that too many white parents are saying, look, you guys are going to make my kids hate their own race, hate their own country. And the people who support some aspect of what's called critical race theory should be saying, no. This is not about hating America or hating a race at all. This is about understanding how we can get better as a country, how we can get better as a stew of races that we are in this country. It's not about accusation or blame or hate at all. There almost is this false hidden assumption that something has to be perfect in order to be loved. And we all know in our personal lives, none of us would be loved if those around us required perfection. And that's not required with respect to race, with respect to national policy and institution. So we have to say, love is a commitment. You can love your country, be committed to your country while seeing all of its flaws that need correction. This is one of many, right? And so if it's done right, again, ideology is going to push it to an extreme. But we're always it's like Aristotle said about any virtue. There's a corresponding two vices, a deficit and a surplus. For courage, there is the deficit of cowardice. You don't have enough of something. You run from danger. And there's a surplus. There's a too much, where you have a rashness, a careless craziness about danger, the extreme sports craziness stuff, and courage is a midpoint, right? It's not going to either extreme, whereas ideology is always about going to extremes. So when we see somebody going to an extreme, the approach should never be, you're totally wrong in every possible way. The approach should be, okay, let's pull that extreme back in and see what the legitimate concern is here. And let's talk about that. Now, let's not talk about the extreme, because once we've talked about the legitimate concern, you may give up the extreme yourself, realizing you don't need to go that far.
Well, and I also say to the African-American who was going and talking to KKK members, he didn't do it at scale. And I think that's another piece, is that he did it individually. And that's what people, because for me, and you know this about me, I have so many conservative friends that when I sit down and talk to them one-on-one, we don't yell and scream at each other. We don't call each other names. I'll say to them, come on, dude, we're close together on this defund the police thing. You said that you guys on the left want more mental health. You want psychology. You want de-escalation training. You want cameras. You want all the things that the police want, by the way.
Yeah. Right.
So if you talk to the police, saying that they're racist as a group, as an institution, that's not the right approach, because it just doesn't work. And that's another thing too. When you see, like I've seen firsthand in this 2 weeks that I've been interviewing folks, is that we're not that far apart. When I talk to my conservative friends and my liberal friends, I'm like, guys, where are we with that? So Gilgamesh had a happy ending. What happened there? What happened? What was it that took Gilgamesh from this crazy narcissistic leader to his place of peace and serenity and or well-being? What was it in the story that you believe altered his change, his ideological change?
Well, he first had to come to care about something other than himself, which he did. I mean, so his people get sick of his behavior, his exploitive behavior, sexually exploited to all the pretty women in the kingdom, in other ways exploiting toward the men and the older women and all this. And they finally pray to the gods, do something about this guy. We can't stand him anymore. And you think that in answer to the prayer, there's going to be a well-placed lightning bolt, or something like that, right? The gods are going to do something, are going to intervene in a way that really makes sense. No, what they do is they create a counterpart to him, a guy who's just as strong, just as handsome, just as powerful, and just as charismatic. But he's the opposite in a lot of ways, because Gilgamesh is a man of the city. They created a man in the forest, a man who grows up with the animals, who's going to be the first equal Gilgamesh ever meets, and they fight and kind of fall in love with each other. There's the first bromance of human history in our first story. Gilgamesh starts caring about this guy, Enkidu, and the long story short, Enkidu dies. And there's this huge loss in Gilgamesh's life, and he understands mortality for the first time. He understands limitations for the first time. He understands caring about something other than his own ego for the first time. And he goes on this quest to try to defeat mortality, a quest for eternal life, which of course doesn't work, but in the process of which he's kind of transformed. And so we get one of our most deep motifs in human literature and life, the adventure that results in transformation. The hero on a quest who is transformed and then comes back and does good things for his people. So it was almost like in the Iliad, which is often called the greatest anti-war book ever written. It's about the Trojan War, of course. And there's all this tragic loss of life depicted viscerally throughout the Iliad. And somebody ever once asked me, well, how did the people like, even the Greek leaders are at war with each other, Agamemnon and Achilles. They're supposed to be fighting the Trojans, but they're mostly fighting each other, in various ways. And how do they get over that? How is that healed? It's because they both have to come into contact with something they value more than their own egos. And it happens in some really poignant stories within the Iliad. Two guys are going to fight each other on the battlefield, and one of them just says, look, before we do this, it's going to be a one-on-one battle, and their teammates are standing on the sidelines. They're just going to fight it out, these two guys. And then one of the guys says, look, before we do this, I've really noticed how good you are in battle. Can you tell me something about yourself? I've just never seen anybody as good as you on your side of the divide here. And the guy says to himself, why is this idiot asking me to talk about myself? We've got to fight, But he says, all right. And he starts talking about himself. And the other guy realizes, wait a minute, your grandfather was my grandfather's best friend. Right. And it's like all of a sudden they come to this realization, it's stupid for one of them to kill the other, regardless of how it comes out. It's stupid. Their grandfathers were best friends. They should be friends. And so they trade armor with each other so that everybody will know these two guys are not to be touched. And it's this really poignant thing, but they have to find a point of contact. They have to find something they both value other than their own egos. And that seems to be the recipe for getting people out of ideologies. They have to come to value something more than their own egos that aren't valued because of their egos.
Right.
And that show them a new way.